In 1986, the Monroe family vanished without a trace during a road trip through the Nevada desert. 11 years later, a dusty camcorder rolls out of a drainage tunnel after a storm. Inside, a chilling home video shot by their young son reveals the final days of a family stalked by something or someone that was never supposed to be found. It was the summer of 1986, and the Monroe family was finally hitting the road. Rick had spent months mapping the route. Dana packed the RV with enough canned chili and board games to last 2 weeks, and 10-year-old Josh was armed with his brand-new VHS camcorder, a birthday gift he wouldn't put down for a second. Their plan was simple: tour the national parks of the Southwest, camp under the stars, and spend time together before life pulled them in different directions. Josh was starting middle school in the fall. Rick was up for a promotion. Dana had just started her own small baking business. This trip was their reset, a moment to unplug and be a family again. On June 20, they were seen at Red Rock Pass in Nevada by a group of fellow campers who remembered the family well. Rick had helped jumpstart a neighboring camper's van, Dana shared blueberry muffins with some kids playing nearby, and Josh was filming chipmunks like they were National Geographic stars. They seemed happy, normal, maybe even a little too eager to make every second count. No one could have known it would be the last time anyone saw them. 3 days later, park rangers found the Monroe's RV parked just off a remote service road on the southern edge of the park. It was locked from the inside. The windows were intact. The engine was cold. Inside, the table was still set with paper plates and half-eaten sandwiches. Dana's camera bag was slung over the back of a chair, untouched. Rick's wallet sat on the dash. Josh's camcorder rested on the table, battery dead. There were no signs of a break-in. No blood, no overturned furniture, just a strange stillness, like the moment after someone turns off a movie in the middle of a scene. The authorities launched a full-scale search. Dogs combed the trails. Helicopters circled for days. Volunteers spread out across the arid valleys and red cliffs. But there was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away, no tire tracks in the dust. Just an empty RV and a family that seemed to have evaporated into the desert air. Eventually, the search ended. The files were boxed and labeled cold. And for over a decade, that's exactly what the case remained. Cold, silent, forgotten. Until one day in the summer of 1997, when something finally floated back to the surface. 11 years later, almost to the day, a violent summer storm swept through a small Nevada town 50 miles from Red Rock Pass. Rain hammered the hills and filled the dry arroyos with torrents of rushing water, washing debris down culverts and drainage tunnels, long clogged by leaves and desert dust. It was the kind of flash flood locals had learned to respect, short, sudden, and capable of dragging entire trees into the storm system in minutes. When it passed, the town woke to the usual mess: mud-caked roads, fallen limbs, and drainage grates choked with twisted branches and broken fencing. 2 city workers, clearing out a tunnel that ran beneath the old access road, were the first to spot it. Wedged behind a grate, half buried in silt and tangled brush, was a plastic object coated in filth. One of them reached in with a gloved hand and pulled it free, brushing off the muck to reveal the lens of a camcorder. It was sun-bleached and cracked, a relic of the 80s, with peeling stickers and a brittle handle nearly snapped in half. Tucked inside the side compartment was a VHS-C tape, miraculously intact, labeled in faded marker, Josh, June, 86. At first, no one thought much of it. Probably lost by some vacationing kid decades ago, but when the workers turned it over to the local sheriff's office, a deputy with a long memory made the connection. The Monroe family, the missing RV, the boy with the camcorder. The case had been dormant for over a decade, but this was a thread worth pulling. The tape was sent to the state lab for professional cleaning and transfer. Mold had eaten away at parts of it, but most of the footage was salvageable. When the first frames flickered on screen days later, investigators leaned forward, eyes locked on a grainy image of a boy in a red t-shirt, pointing the camera at himself and laughing. The desert landscape behind him looked familiar. sun-bleached rocks, wind-carved cliffs, the blurred outline of an RV in the distance. It was Josh Monroe, alive, smiling, holding the camera that had somehow, after 11 long years, found its way out of the desert and back into the hands of those still looking for answers. The RV was found just 3 days after the Monroe family was last seen, parked near a narrow service road that twisted away from the main campsite like a forgotten path. Rangers stumbled on it by accident while checking for illegal fire pits. From the outside, nothing looked particularly strange. The vehicle was clean, tires intact, no broken windows. The door was locked from the inside, which was unusual but not alarming. They expected to find a family asleep inside, maybe a couple enjoying the quiet away from the crowd. But when they finally forced the door open, what they found made their stomachs sink. Inside, the air was stale, dry like an attic, sealed shut for years. 2 half-eaten peanut butter sandwiches sat on the dinette table, one of them with a bite taken out, the crust curled and stiff. A red plastic cup had tipped over onto a newspaper, the ink bled into unreadable smears. Dana's sunglasses were folded neatly on the counter. Rick's wallet lay open on the dashboard, with cash and cards untouched. Josh's small camcorder sat dead on the seat across from the table, lens pointed toward the back of the RV. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood. But there was something else, something harder to name, a strange stillness, as if everyone had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of life. A board game had been set up on the carpet, halfway through a round. A pair of children's sneakers were placed side by side near the door. It felt paused, not abandoned. Outside, the dust showed no tire tracks leading away. Rangers swept the area, called in search teams, and launched helicopters to cover the canyons and plateaus surrounding Red Rock Pass. Over the following days, more than 100 volunteers and law enforcement officers joined the effort, combing every inch of trail, brush, and ravine. They found nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a shoe print, not a broken branch to suggest which direction they might have gone. And after 2 weeks of searching, the rescue operation quietly shifted into recovery. The RV was towed, inspected, and sealed in storage. The Monroe file was stamped with a new heading: missing. No leads, no suspects, no trace. What unsettled investigators the most wasn't what they found inside the RV, it was what they didn't. There were no defensive wounds, no bloodstains hidden beneath the carpet, no signs of forced entry or a frantic departure. The interior was eerily pristine, like a museum exhibit frozen in the middle of a summer afternoon. But the longer the team studied it, the more certain they became that something had gone terribly wrong. Dana's purse was tucked behind the passenger seat, untouched. Her driver's license, keys, makeup bag, even a half-full tube of sunscreen were all inside. Rick's toolkit was stored neatly beneath the kitchenette bench. Josh's favorite comic books were piled beside the fold-out bed, one open to a dog-eared page, as if he'd stepped away for just a moment. None of it added up. If they had been attacked, where were the signs? If they had chosen to run, why leave behind their money, their IDs, their only vehicle? And then there was the chair. A lightweight aluminum camping chair lay folded and toppled just outside the RV's door, partially buried in dust. At first glance, it seemed like a breeze could have knocked it over, but the dirt pattern around its legs suggested it had been dragged, not blown. About 5 feet away, one of Josh's sneakers was found, just one, half buried and frayed along the edge of the sole, as if it had been pulled off while someone was running or stumbling. Investigators zeroed in on that patch of ground, bringing in canine units to trace any scent. The dogs circled for a while, tails high, noses sweeping the dirt. Then they moved east, toward a narrow path leading into the brush. For a brief moment, there was hope, but after half a mile, the trail vanished. The dogs lost the scent. The scrubland swallowed the trail, and with it, any chance of knowing what had happened in those crucial final moments. Back at the station, the evidence board filled up fast. Maps, photos, witness notes, empty checklists. And yet, it all pointed to the same dead end. The Monroes had simply disappeared, leaving behind their belongings, their RV, and a silence too deep for answers. The official search lasted 15 days. Each morning, volunteers fanned out with water bottles and radios, scanning the vast red terrain under a punishing desert sun. Helicopters skimmed treetops, infrared cameras combed dry washes and canyons, and dive teams plunged into shaded water holes that barely held more than runoff. Tips poured in from hikers and drifters, each one leading nowhere. Some claimed they saw a boy matching Josh's description near a gas station. Others thought they heard cries coming from a distant ravine. Every lead ended in dust and silence. By the second week, hope began to dry up with the heat. The Monroe family seemed to have vanished along with their footprints. Investigators brought in experts, geologists, behavioral analysts, even a retired military tracker. No one could explain how three people, healthy and experienced with outdoor travel, could simply disappear from a stationary vehicle without leaving behind any clear direction of travel. No torn clothing, no trail of supplies, not even buzzards circling in the sky. It was as if they had stepped off the map. The media ran with it. Local papers dubbed it the vanishing RV. While a few national outlets leaned into the mystery, theories flourished. One suggested the family had staged their own disappearance to escape financial pressure, though bank records showed no unusual activity. Another insisted they'd fallen victim to a drifter or desert cult, but no evidence of foul play was ever uncovered. A fringe few speculated about something stranger, UFOs, time slips. As the months turned into years, the Monroe case slipped quietly out of the headlines. The missing posters, once stapled to trailheads and tacked up on diner bulletin boards, faded under the sun until the ink ran pale and the corners curled with age. Red Rock Pass carried on as usual. Campers came and went, rangers patrolled, and new families parked where the RV had once stood. Most didn't know the story. A few locals still remembered, but only in passing, like the way people talk about old ghost sightings or strange weather that happened before they were born. The official file remained open but dormant. Every so often, a new investigator would pull it from storage, shuffle through the notes, and reach the same conclusion. No suspects, no credible sightings. No physical evidence beyond what was found inside the RV. With no bodies and no crime scene, there was nothing to charge, nothing to follow, and nothing left to hope for. That didn't stop people from talking. Over time, the mystery took on a life of its own. Some swore they'd seen shadowy figures in the cliffs above the campgrounds. Others believed the family had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see, an illegal operation, a government secret, something buried deep in the desert that was never meant to be found. Late-night radio shows spun stories of underground bunkers and secret roads wiped from maps. A few callers claimed they'd heard voices echoing through the hills at night, voices that didn't belong to any living person. Josh's camcorder became a focus for amateur sleuths, though few believed it would ever turn up. For a long time, no one thought it even existed. Some argued it had been taken by whoever made the family disappear. Others assumed it had simply been lost to time, buried under sand or stolen from the RV before authorities arrived. It became one of those details that haunted the case, not because it held answers, but because it might have. By the mid-90s, the Monroe name was a footnote in a growing archive of unsolved disappearances. It was a case frozen in time. That was until the summer storm of 1997, when a drainage tunnel coughed up something long buried, something that had been waiting in the dark all along. The storm that swept through Calico Ridge in late June of 1997 wasn't the worst they'd seen, but it was sudden and hard enough to shake loose years of debris from the desert's veins. Water surged down hillsides and into culverts, choked with forgotten trash, runoff slamming into metal grates and concrete tunnels with enough force to carry along pieces of fence posts, dead brush, rusted cans, and other fragments from long ago. When it cleared, city workers were dispatched to clean out the drainage systems before the next storm season hit. One of them, Ted Harmon, had worked the route for 12 years. He knew every bend of the culvert near mile marker 42, and when his rake struck something solid that refused to budge, he assumed it was another concrete block washed in from the hills. Instead, he pulled out a compact VHS camcorder, crusted in mud and grit, with one of its side panels broken clean off. The casing was scratched, the grip rotted, but the tape compartment was intact. Peeling back the grime, Ted spotted the faded words written in permanent marker across a sticker on the tape inside. It read, "Josh, June 86." He turned it over to the county maintenance office, mostly out of curiosity. It took less than 24 hours for the sheriff's department to call him back. The tape was logged as evidence and sent to the state forensic lab in Carson City, where technicians carefully extracted it from the corroded housing. It was warped and water-stained, parts of it too damaged to recover, but there were still usable segments. Static buzzed through the first few seconds, then cleared enough to reveal a sunlit image of a boy, tan skin, straight dark hair, front teeth missing, smiling as he pointed the lens at himself, and said something about how many lizards he had counted that morning. The team froze. It was Josh Monroe. It had to be. News traveled fast. Within days, the Monroe file was reactivated, and the camcorder was placed in a sealed evidence locker under 24-hour security. Everyone who had touched the case a decade earlier wanted back in, because now there was proof. After 11 years of silence, the Monroes had left something behind, and it was finally speaking. The VHS tape was fragile, its edges swollen from years of moisture, but technicians worked through the night to preserve what they could. The footage was digitized, stabilized, and enhanced frame by frame. The first few minutes were standard home video fare, Josh giggling behind the lens as he filmed ants on a rock, his parents laughing in the background, and a short clip of Rick burning toast over the RV's tiny stove while Dana teased him from the fold-out couch. Sunlight poured through the windows, and wind chimes jingled softly outside. For a moment, it was just a family on vacation, caught in time before the darkness took hold. Josh narrates most of it, his voice high and eager, talking directly to the camera like a tour guide in his own little world. He pans across the valley behind their campsite, listing off animals he's spotted and giving a weather report with exaggerated seriousness. Dana appears holding a paper plate of muffins. Rick jokes that he's lost the map again. It's sweet, ordinary, and heartbreakingly normal. But just past the 15-minute mark, the tone shifts, the lighting changes, the footage gets shakier. Josh starts filming from behind the RV curtain instead of out in the open. He whispers into the mic, saying he thinks someone's watching them. At first, it's easy to dismiss as a child's imagination until Dana's voice cuts in, low and nervous, asking Rick if he locked the side door. There's a short exchange, partially muffled, where Rick says something about seeing a man near the ridge earlier that afternoon. Josh keeps filming through the window, and, for a split second, the image captures a blurry figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Technicians replayed that segment dozens of times. The figure doesn't move. It's too far to identify, but it's there. Tall, motionless, facing the RV. Then the screen cuts to black. It comes back a moment later with Josh's face filling the frame, lips tight, eyes wide. He whispers that the man was still there at sunset. He says his mom didn't want him filming anymore. That was the last full scene before the tape degraded again. But in those minutes, the entire case changed. After 11 years, this wasn't just a disappearance. This was a warning. And someone had been watching. After the footage was reviewed in full, a quiet urgency settled over the investigation. The case was no longer just a historical curiosity, no longer a mystery tucked away in an old file cabinet. It was real again, alive. Detectives who had long since moved on returned to the evidence board, now freshly covered in stills pulled from the video. Josh's voice was printed out and analyzed. The timestamp on the tape was cross-referenced with known weather conditions, matching perfectly with a brief overcast period on June 4, 1986. The details were lining up. This wasn't a hoax. It was their last record. Technicians worked around the clock to salvage more from the degraded portions of the tape. Each new frame was combed for background details, landscape markers, anything that could place the Monroes in a more specific location. Eventually, a sharp-eyed analyst spotted something, a jagged rock formation behind the RV that resembled a split peak just west of Falcon Ridge, a stretch that had been largely overlooked during the original search. At the time, it was considered too steep and remote, a place no family with a child would ever camp, but the tape said otherwise. Investigators returned to the area with renewed focus. Meanwhile, the tape circulated among federal offices. The grainy image of the man standing at the tree line was enhanced, enlarged, color-corrected. He wore a long coat despite the heat. No one could make out his face. There was no movement, no visible threat, but his presence felt deliberate. He wasn't just passing by. He had stopped. He was watching. And whoever he was, he made the Monroes uneasy enough to speak about it in hushed voices. Josh, even at 10, had sensed the change. He kept filming, despite being told not to. That camera, buried for over a decade, was never meant to be found, which raised a chilling question. If Josh had hidden the tape, why? There was one final clip at the end of the recovered footage. Just a flash. A few seconds of Josh lying in his sleeping bag, whispering to the camera again, barely audible. His eyes didn't blink. His voice was smaller this time. He said he heard footsteps outside the RV. Then, a pause. And then, "Dad's gone." The final moments of the tape left investigators rattled. Josh's small voice, barely louder than the rustling of nylon in his sleeping bag, seemed to carry more fear than any scream could. The words weren't shouted. They were whispered, like he didn't want whoever was outside to hear. "Dad's gone," he said again, followed by a rustle and the soft click of the camera being turned off. That was where the footage ended. No more images, no more sound, just static. The lab tried everything to recover what might have come next, but the tape was too far gone. If there had been more, if Josh had tried to record what happened after, those pieces were lost to time, washed out by floodwater or eroded from the inside by heat and dust. Still, that final whisper changed everything. It was no longer a vague suggestion of a stranger near their campsite. It was a direct account from within the RV, in real time, from a frightened boy who had just realized his father was no longer where he should have been. Investigators reviewed the old RV inspection again, now with fresh eyes. Back then, the absence of blood or signs of struggle had been baffling. But now, in light of the tape, it made more sense. If Rick had left voluntarily, perhaps to confront someone outside, it might explain the lack of damage or evidence. It also meant whatever happened to him likely took place away from the RV, somewhere deeper in the brush, out of view. And if Rick never returned, that meant Dana and Josh were left inside to wait and wonder. Search teams were reassembled. They focused on the terrain behind the ridge shown in the video, studying satellite images and comparing landmarks. It was slow, methodical work, but it gave the case a pulse again. Law enforcement remained tight-lipped, but off the record, one source said the video had changed the tone entirely. What had once looked like a spontaneous disappearance now resembled something else, something planned, something watched. And in the middle of it all was Josh, just 10 years old, using his camcorder not as a toy, but as a record, as if he knew that one day someone would need to see what he saw. Someone would need to know what came for them. The tape revealed something else that had gone unnoticed at first, a series of quick shots, shaky and brief, recorded during what appeared to be an impromptu hike. The angle was uneven, likely because Josh was walking while filming, trying to keep up with his parents ahead. In one segment, the camera pans past a narrow crevice in the rocks, barely wide enough to walk through. Rick can be heard off camera saying something about taking a shortcut back toward the valley floor. Dana's voice responds, hesitant, reminding him that this wasn't on any of the maps they'd looked at earlier. Josh stays quiet, breathing hard, the lens bouncing as he climbs. The footage lasts less than 2 minutes, but for investigators, it was the first solid indication that the family had deliberately left the RV to explore an unmarked route. It explained why search teams never found any clear path. If they had veered off trail, away from known landmarks, they would have slipped through the cracks of every planned search grid. The rock formation, once dismissed as too remote for a family trip, was now the center of everything. Aerial scans of the ridge began the next morning. Drones flew over the jagged terrain with infrared cameras, looking for anything unnatural: disturbed soil, old canvas, metal reflections in the brush. Within days, they found something. About a mile from the spot where the RV had been discovered, high up in a narrow bluff, there was a faint indentation in the scrub. It looked like a collapsed structure, mostly buried under rockfall, but with one visible shape that stood out: a rusted tin kettle lying on its side. Crews were sent in on foot. It took hours to climb in safely, weaving between boulders and dead trees scorched by old lightning strikes. What they found wasn't a campsite or a shelter. It was the remains of what might have once been a cabin, crudely built and mostly caved in. No identifying signs, no obvious path leading to it. Just that battered kettle, a few splintered beams, and the strong, unmistakable smell of decay still lingering in the dirt. No one said it out loud at first, but they all knew what they were looking at. This was where something ended. Maybe for Rick. Maybe for all three of them. The remains of the collapsed cabin told a story no one was ready to hear. Most of it had been crushed under years of rockfall and erosion, but a few pieces of the structure were still intact. Investigators worked cautiously, clearing brush and carefully removing debris by hand. Beneath a half-buried beam, they found a rusted cot frame. Nearby, under a layer of charred wood and hardened soil, was a small pile of items that had no business being there: an old hiking boot, partially melted nylon rope, and a metal belt buckle engraved with the initials R.M. DNA testing would take time, but the belt buckle sent a chill through the team. Rick Monroe's initials. He had owned a belt like that, according to photos submitted during the original investigation. It had been a gift from Dana the Christmas before they disappeared. The item list grew longer with each careful sweep. A cracked thermos, a flashlight with a broken lens, a shirt fragment still clinging to what looked like a collarbone. No full skeleton yet, but the signs were unmistakable. Something had happened here, and whoever had built the structure hadn't left willingly. By the second day, the forensics team confirmed what they already suspected. The site wasn't just a forgotten hideout or an old mining shack. It was a scene, maybe of a confrontation, maybe of something worse. The bones, though weathered and scattered, showed clear signs of trauma. One rib was cleanly fractured. A hairline crack in a femur looked consistent with blunt force. There were no bullet casings, no knife marks, but the violence had been personal, messy, and likely sudden. News of the discovery didn't go public right away. Investigators wanted to be certain. The Monroe family, or at least part of them, had made it out of the RV alive. But somewhere along that detour off the main trail, they had encountered something or someone that turned a summer trip into a nightmare. And if Rick had died here, the question became far more pressing. Where were Dana and Josh in those final moments? Were they nearby? Had they been watching from the trees? Or had they already been taken, swallowed by the silence long before the rocks came crashing down? As word of the discovery at the collapsed cabin reached those closest to the original case, a quiet ripple of grief moved through the few who still carried the weight of it. Rick's sister, who had spent years placing flyers in post offices and calling every campground west of the Rockies, was brought in for DNA comparison. It would take weeks for results to confirm what everyone already feared, but no one questioned it anymore. The belt buckle, the boot, the location, it all pointed to Rick Monroe. While forensics processed the remains, investigators turned back to the tape. One segment in particular had gone overlooked. At the 12-minute mark, the camera pans past Josh's face and catches something odd in the distance, barely visible in the grainy image, but enough to make out the slope of a roof. Not the RV. Not a tent. Something smaller and rougher, tucked into the shadow of a canyon wall. They compared it to recent drone footage. The structure matched the dimensions of the collapsed cabin. Josh had filmed it without realizing its significance. Or maybe he had realized and kept filming anyway. They began to believe the Monroe family hadn't stumbled across the cabin by chance. Something had led them there. Whether it was curiosity, fear, or the appearance of someone who convinced them it was safe, no one could say for certain. But it was becoming clear that the Monroes had interacted with someone, possibly more than once. The sighting of the figure in the tape, the suggestion that Rick had left the RV at night, and now the signs of a physical struggle at the cabin all pointed in one direction. One investigator quietly pulled a file that hadn't been opened in years. It belonged to a man named Paul Rendell, a loner who had lived in the area during the mid-'80s. He had no known relatives, no official address, but was rumored to have squatted in the hills near Falcon Ridge after being discharged from the military. He disappeared shortly after the Monroes. At the time, no one connected the two. But now, with Rick's remains uncovered at what might have been Rendell's hideout, that silence felt less like coincidence and more like a shadow cast deliberately over something long buried. Paul Rendell's name hadn't meant much in 1986. He had shown up in a handful of ranger reports as a nuisance, a quiet man who sometimes camped too close to the main trails, often alone, always drifting. He wasn't aggressive, never arrested, and didn't leave much of a paper trail. But there had been enough minor complaints to get him noticed. A few hikers had mentioned a man watching from the hills, always just far enough away to avoid confrontation. Rangers spoke of strange handmade traps found in the underbrush, animal bones arranged in odd patterns, and campsites that looked like someone had left in a hurry but planned to return. By the time the Monroes vanished, Rendell had already slipped out of sight. Now, more than a decade later, his file was being read with a different lens. His last known location placed him near Falcon Ridge, close to where the collapsed cabin had been found. A grainy photo taken in 1984 showed a wiry man with hollow eyes and tangled hair, wearing what looked like the same long coat caught in Josh's footage. No one ever declared Rendell a missing person. He had simply disappeared into the desert, forgotten by nearly everyone, except maybe by those who knew what to look for. Investigators returned to the ruins of the cabin, this time with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Beneath the far corner of the structure, buried beneath layers of compacted dirt and stone, they found something unexpected, a crawl space. Inside were the rotted remains of a cot, old canned goods, and a journal sealed in plastic. Most of the pages were waterlogged and unreadable, but the entries that survived told a fragmented story. Rendell wrote about them, watching him, about the family that had come too close, and about needing to protect what he called the silence. His tone swung between paranoia and control, at times lucid, at times terrifying. He never mentioned names, but one phrase kept repeating: the boy with the camera. He wrote it over and over in the margins, sometimes underlined, sometimes in bold, shaky loops. Rendell had seen Josh. Maybe he had followed them. Maybe he had invited them to the cabin. Whatever the truth was, it was clear now someone had been watching the Monroes, and someone had wanted their story to stay buried. The final journal entries were dated June 6, 1986, 2 days after the Monroes were last seen. Rendell's handwriting grew increasingly frantic, with whole sections crossed out and rewritten in jittery strokes. He mentioned the RV. He described seeing a child through the window, filming. He wrote that he had tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen. In one passage, nearly torn through the page, he claimed he had to act before they exposed the path. Investigators weren't sure what that meant. There was no mention of a motive, no confession in the traditional sense, just delusions, or perhaps intentions, scribbled in the margins of a deeply fractured mind. Then, without explanation, the journal stopped. No closing thoughts, no signature, just a gap where pages had once been torn or maybe burned. But Rendell's presence was undeniable. He had been there. He had watched them. He had written about the boy. And now his cabin sat in ruins, hiding what was likely the last moments of Rick Monroe's life. Forensics confirmed it shortly after. The remains recovered near the cabin matched Rick's DNA, using his sister's sample as reference. There was no longer any question. Rick had died up there, likely during an encounter with Rendell. Whether he had fought back, fled, or tried to protect his family, no one could say for certain. But one thing was clear: he had not left the RV voluntarily for something routine. He had gone to face someone. Maybe he thought he could reason with him. Maybe he thought it would keep Dana and Josh safe. If Rendell had killed Rick, the next question was what happened afterward. The journal made no mention of Dana or Josh after that date. No notes, no sightings, no remains. It was as if the family had fractured at that moment, Rick dying near the cabin, and the rest vanishing into the silence that followed. Search crews expanded the grid, pushing farther west toward dry washes and sandstone outcroppings where wind could carry a sound, but footprints vanished within hours. They found no new evidence, just empty land, eroded cliffs, and the weight of time closing in around what remained. But one piece of that story had survived. A 10-year-old boy, with a camcorder, had left behind proof that someone was there. And maybe, just maybe, that same boy had found a way to escape. The confirmation of Rick Monroe's death was both a breakthrough and a heartbreak. For investigators, it was the first concrete answer after more than a decade of questions. For Rick's sister, it was the closure she had begged for but never wanted to receive. She hadn't spoken publicly since the initial disappearance, but when contacted after the remains were identified, she gave a quiet, measured statement. She said Rick had always been the kind of man who put his family before himself. If he died up there, it was because he was trying to protect them. With Rick's fate finally known, attention shifted completely to Dana and Josh. The recovered tape continued to be reviewed for new clues, with enhanced audio and color correction offering a few more details. In one slowed frame, just before the recording cut out for the last time, a blurry shape could be seen behind Josh's shoulder, low to the ground and partially hidden by brush. It wasn't clear whether it was a person or just movement, but it suggested Josh was not alone when filming that final whisper. The words still echoed through the footage. "Dad's gone, I have to go now." Those 7 words were interpreted by analysts, behavioral experts, even trauma psychologists. Some believed Josh had seen what happened to his father and fled, hiding the camera in the only place he thought it might survive. Others suggested he had been instructed to leave it behind, a kind of forced farewell in the face of something far worse. But one possibility, growing louder by the day, was that Josh might have made it out. That he had escaped whatever nightmare unfolded near the cabin and found a way to disappear before Rendell could reach him. There were no known sightings, no calls, no footprints left in the dirt. But then came a tip that had once seemed too weak to pursue. Back in 1989, 3 years after the disappearance, a woman passing through a small town in Utah reported seeing a boy at a gas station. He was dirty, barefoot, and refused help. She remembered his eyes most of all, wide, sunburned, alert. The attendant told her the boy had wandered off before police arrived. At the time, it was just another ghost story. Now, it was back on the board. Josh Monroe might not have vanished. He might have survived. And if he did, the desert hadn't buried the whole truth, just part of it. The woman who reported the sighting in Utah had never forgotten the boy's face. She told investigators that something about him had stuck with her all these years, not just the way he looked, but the way he moved. She described him as alert but silent, like a stray animal that had learned to study everything before taking a step. She had tried to offer him food, a soda, even called the gas station clerk to help. But the boy hadn't spoken. He had glanced over his shoulder twice, then vanished behind the building before anyone could stop him. At the time, it didn't match any active cases. The Monroe file had long since gone cold, buried under a backlog of other missing persons reports. But now, with Rick's remains confirmed and the videotape finally in hand, that fleeting sighting gained new weight. Investigators traveled to the small desert town to re-examine the area. They spoke with retired employees from the gas station, searched local shelters, even checked enrollment records at nearby schools. Nothing turned up. There were no fingerprints, no footage from security cameras, because in 1989, few places had them. But the timeline fit. Josh would have been 13. The description matched. And the boy's behavior, frantic, solitary, on foot, matched what you'd expect from someone who had survived something unspeakable. The terrain between Red Rock Pass and that gas station was unforgiving. If Josh had made it there, he would have had to navigate 30 miles of hard desert and rocky slope with little water and no trail. But investigators weren't ruling it out. If he had seen what happened to his father, if he knew the danger wasn't over, he might have fled as far and as fast as he could, surviving off instinct alone. The idea began to take shape. Maybe Josh had hidden the tape intentionally, rolling it into the drainage tunnel because he knew no one would find it unless they were looking in the right place at the right time. Maybe he had hoped, even then, that someone would listen. The thought that he had walked away from the RV and outlived what happened in those canyons no longer felt like a stretch. It felt like a possibility. The kind of possibility that sends a case spiraling back into motion after more than a decade of silence. The possibility that Josh had survived began to reframe the entire investigation. What had once seemed like a complete tragedy now opened up into something far more complex, a story not only of loss, but of endurance. And if he had lived, even briefly, the search wasn't just for answers anymore, it was for a witness, maybe the only one who knew exactly what happened in those final hours. A forensic linguist was brought in to study the last few words Josh spoke on the tape, the tone, the pacing, the breath between phrases. "Dad's gone. I have to go now." There was no panic in his voice. Just resolve. Like a decision had been made. It suggested he wasn't fleeing in chaos, but with purpose, as if he knew what had to be done, and more importantly, where to go. Investigators wondered if Dana had instructed him to run, if she had stayed behind, hoping to distract whoever was out there, or if, by then, she was already gone. Searchers returned to the dry creek system that ran west of the cabin. The terrain there hadn't been fully covered during the original effort. Drones flew overhead again, this time with more precise mapping software, flagging every deviation in the earth, collapsed mine shafts, hidden depressions, man-made structures reclaimed by the sand. One of those blips caught the attention of a ranger who had been on the original search team back in 1986. It was a narrow ravine with a concrete tunnel built decades earlier to redirect water during storms. At the time, it had been dry and blocked by boulders. He remembered passing it by, figuring it led nowhere. But now, that same tunnel had become the most important location in the case. It was the one the camcorder had emerged from after the storm. Investigators began to piece it together. If Josh had hidden the camera, it had to be upstream, somewhere in that winding series of runoff channels. Maybe he thought someone would find it. Maybe he didn't have time to finish recording. Maybe that's where he had gone next. Crews moved in slowly, scanning every inch of the tunnel. The air was thick and cold, a strange contrast to the heat above. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a drainage ditch. It might have been a lifeline. Or a grave. The tunnel was narrow and uneven, built decades earlier as part of a failed water diversion system. It had long since been forgotten, buried beneath sand and scrub, its opening nearly sealed shut by years of erosion. But as investigators moved deeper inside, their flashlights caught something beneath the silt, a cluster of weather-worn objects half buried in the mud. Carefully, they began to clear it. The first item was a torn flannel shirt, faded from sun and time, the collar still intact. Beneath it lay a canvas pouch containing a rusted compass, 2 granola wrappers, and a Polaroid photograph. The image had nearly faded to white, but after careful drying and digital enhancement, shapes began to emerge. A boy, crouched beside a rock, holding something in his hands. His face was hard to make out, but the size, posture, and setting all pointed to one conclusion. It was Josh. The tunnel walls told another part of the story, scratches near the entrance, as if someone had tried to wedge something into the rocks. On one wall, faint but visible under the right light, were the letters JM etched with something sharp. They were uneven, hurried, almost desperate, but they were unmistakable. Farther in, the passage narrowed, and the ground dipped into a shallow bowl of hardened runoff. There, behind a fallen sheet of corrugated steel, investigators found what looked like a makeshift bed of leaves and worn fabric. It was dry, protected, and surprisingly intact. Someone had spent time here, days maybe, possibly longer. But what they didn't find was more telling than anything else. No bones, no blood, no sign of a body. Whatever had happened in that tunnel, Josh hadn't died there. He had sheltered. He had waited. He had written his initials into the wall, taken a photograph, and hidden the camera, perhaps knowing it might be his only voice left behind. The theory now carried weight. Josh had escaped the cabin, crossed dangerous terrain, and hidden long enough to plan his next move. Whether he had been found later by someone else, wandered into another town, or simply vanished deeper into the desert, no one knew. But for the first time, they had proof that he had survived, at least for a while, and that he had left a trail, faint but real, winding through the tunnels and shadows where no one thought to look. The Polaroid was handed over to specialists who worked to recover every possible detail. With each pass through enhancement software, new pieces emerged. The terrain behind Josh matched an outcropping less than half a mile from the tunnel. In the photo, the sunlight was low and sharp, suggesting early morning. Josh's eyes were wide but focused, and in his hands he held a small bundle of cloth. Zooming in revealed what looked like a piece of fabric patterned with small red flowers, Dana's blouse, last seen hanging on a hook inside the RV. It shifted the narrative once again. If Josh had taken the blouse with him, had he done so to remember her, or had she been with him? The forensic team scoured the tunnel for fibers, fingerprints, any second trace that might place Dana there too. They found none. But tucked into the lining of the canvas pouch with the compass and wrappers was something else, a page torn from a paperback, creased and refolded a dozen times. The passage wasn't marked, but the words seemed intentional. It described a character who couldn't go back, who had lost everything, but still chose to walk forward into the unknown because it meant freedom. The discovery was quietly devastating, not because it suggested Dana was gone, but because it painted a portrait of a child trying to carry a piece of his family with him. Whether that torn page was Josh's doing or something he found and clung to, it told investigators more than any evidence had so far. He hadn't just run, he had mourned, he had remembered. And he had resisted being erased. What Rendell had done at the cabin was horrific. But what Josh had done afterward, navigating the desert alone, marking his path, leaving symbols behind in the hope someone would follow, revealed something far more powerful. He had left a legacy, quiet and incomplete, but enough. Enough to reopen the case. Enough to bring his father home. Enough to stir belief that Dana might still be out there too, waiting somewhere, part of a story that still refused to be buried. The camcorder hadn't just been a message, it had been a map. And now, piece by piece, The people who once searched only for closure were beginning to search for something else entirely: survival. When the DNA results came back, they confirmed what many already believed but hadn't dared to say aloud. The remains found at the collapsed cabin belonged to Rick Monroe. The final match brought an official end to the question of his fate, but it didn't bring peace. If anything, it deepened the mystery. He had died violently, far from the RV, in a place no one was meant to find. The evidence at the scene suggested confrontation, something sudden, something physical. Whether he had gone to the cabin to reason with Rendell, to protect his family, or simply to buy them time, the outcome had been final. Rick had not made it back. The news was delivered privately to his sister, who had spent the last 11 years holding on to a different version of the story. One where maybe they had gotten lost. One where maybe they had simply decided to disappear. But now there was no more wondering. Rick had died in the desert, and he had died alone. What remained unclear was what happened after. Rendell's journal offered no mention of Rick's final moments, only cryptic phrases about watchers and paths and silence. Investigators now believed the man had descended fully into delusion by the time the Monroes crossed his path. There was no coherent motive, no rational sequence. Only fragments of fear and control that hardened into something dangerous. The last entry in the journal made reference to the boy still watching and the light in the trees. Then the pages stopped. Search teams continued to expand the radius beyond the tunnel. They found a second drainage path that split off further north and led to an old service road, long overgrown. There, beneath a weathered cottonwood tree, they found a series of small stone stacks, 3 in a row, each topped with a smooth, flat rock. They looked almost ceremonial, placed with care rather than randomly. A ranger noted that in some survival scenarios, stacking stones can serve as trail markers, but there was no trail beyond that point. Just open land, stretching toward the horizon. The question still hung in the air. Had Josh made it farther? Had he crossed into some place no one ever thought to look? Or was this where his trail ended, not with a cry for help, but with quiet, deliberate silence? The camcorder had one final secret to offer. In the weeks following the initial discovery, the tape was sent to a lab specializing in analog media degradation. Engineers ran it through a series of high-resolution scans, looking for hidden frames lost between corrupted segments. And buried deep in a static-filled sequence, wedged between 2 abrupt scene cuts, they found something strange, a single frame that had never registered during normal playback. It lasted just a fraction of a second, but it was there. When enhanced and digitally reconstructed, it showed Josh once again. This time, the image was darker. He was crouched near a rock face, holding the camcorder close to his chest. His face was partially obscured, but his expression was different from before. No longer smiling, no longer narrating. He looked serious, focused. Behind him, barely visible in the dimming light, stood a small structure, something like a lean-to or makeshift shelter, constructed from driftwood and canvas. The location didn't match the RV, or the cabin, or the tunnel. It was somewhere else, somewhere still undiscovered. The frame raised new questions. How much farther had Josh gone? Had he built that shelter himself? Was it temporary, or had he been there for days, possibly weeks? And most haunting of all, had Dana been with him when it was taken? The image circulated privately among investigators. None recognized the terrain behind the boy, but geologists believed it could be farther west, near the edge of a dried basin that had once served as a cattle route. That area had never been searched in connection with the Monroe case, written off early as too distant to be relevant. But now, it was being reconsidered. What struck everyone most about the frame wasn't just the shelter or the location, it was the way Josh was holding the camcorder, not like a toy anymore, not even like a tool. He held it like something precious. Something he was protecting. And if he had managed to hide it where it would one day be found, then maybe he had left more. Maybe there were other clues out there, hidden the same way, waiting to speak. The story was no longer just about what had happened in 1986. It was about what a child chose to preserve when everything else was lost. With the enhanced frame in hand, investigators launched a renewed effort into the Western Basin, a flat and sun-scorched stretch of land that had never been included in the original search perimeter. The area was rough, remote, and dotted with the occasional remnant of an old cattle drive trail, half-collapsed fences, broken posts, and rusted metal troughs. For decades, it had been overlooked, a piece of land considered too far, too empty to hold any relevance. But now, it felt like the most important place on the map. Aerial surveys began first, comparing every visible landmark to the background in the still frame of Josh near the shelter. After several days of scanning, a promising match was found, an outcropping of rock with a jagged lip that sloped just enough to match the horizon behind him. Ground teams moved in on foot, careful not to disturb the soil. They found fragments of canvas tangled in the underbrush, pieces of weather-worn rope, and a collapsed pile of stones that looked too purposeful to be natural. The lean-to was real. Josh had been there. But there was no sign of recent activity. No footprints, no bones, no clothing. Whatever had been left had long since faded into the landscape. Still, the discovery was powerful. It confirmed what many had begun to hope, that Josh had survived far beyond the point where the official search had ended. He had crossed impossible terrain, hidden in a tunnel, and built a shelter in the middle of nowhere. He had been smart, resourceful, and determined to stay hidden. Whether it was out of fear or survival instinct, no one knew. But his trail had reached farther than anyone imagined. That was when another old tip surfaced. A retired park ranger from Arizona called in after seeing news of the camcorder's recovery. He remembered an encounter from the early 1990s. A teenage boy had been spotted alone near an abandoned ranger station. He wouldn't give his name. He had a scar on his left arm and carried a weather-beaten bag strapped tight across his chest. The ranger offered him water, but the boy refused. He said he had to keep moving, said he wasn't supposed to be found. Then he disappeared into the trees, leaving behind nothing but questions. And now, possibly, a name. The ranger's report brought new energy to the investigation, even though the sighting had happened years earlier. The timeline fit. If Josh had survived the initial disappearance, made it through the first days or even weeks in the desert, then by the early 90s he would have been a teenager, living off instinct, memory, and whatever his surroundings could offer. The boy the ranger described didn't ask for help, didn't seem confused or lost. He had direction, he had intention. He was running from something or toward something, but either way, he was moving by choice. What struck investigators most was what he had said, "I'm not supposed to be found." It echoed everything they now believed about Josh, that he had made the decision to stay hidden. Maybe he thought it was the only way to stay safe. Maybe he didn't trust anyone, especially not after what happened to his father. Or maybe he thought no one was still looking. But the camcorder suggested otherwise. It hadn't been buried. It had been placed, positioned just carefully enough in that drainage tunnel to survive until the moment someone would notice. The lean-to, the initials carved into stone, the torn page from a novel, the Polaroid, all pieces of a breadcrumb trail that had taken years to piece together. Each one spoke of survival, not surrender. And if Josh had lived long enough to be seen again, even briefly, there was still hope that he might be out there, somewhere. Changed by what he'd endured, but alive. With Rick's remains identified and Rendell's journal secured, the official case file was updated for the first time in over a decade. Dana and Josh were no longer listed as presumed dead. Their statuses were changed to missing, last seen in the Red Rock region, with multiple credible leads suggesting post-disappearance sightings. The file was no longer frozen in time, it was active again. Rick Monroe was laid to rest in a private ceremony, attended only by his sister and a handful of people who had never stopped searching. No media, no speeches. just silence, and a small framed photo of the family before they vanished. A family trip that was supposed to be a simple adventure had become a puzzle etched into the desert, with one last piece still waiting to be found. The drainage tunnel where the camcorder was found is dry now. The floodwaters that uncovered it have long since receded, leaving behind cracked mud and scattered debris along its floor. The city eventually replaced the old grate with a newer one, reinforced and welded shut, more out of protocol than ceremony. But for those who had followed the Monroe case, that tunnel became more than infrastructure. It became a threshold, a place where silence broke, where a forgotten voice rolled back into the world. The footage recovered from that camera did more than answer questions. It stirred old memories, reawakened old leads, and, most importantly, gave weight to something that had always lived in the margins of this story: hope. Not blind hope, not the kind that fades with time, but the quiet, persistent kind that burrows in and waits, the kind that Josh seemed to carry with him, even when no one else knew he was still out there. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened in those final days. The desert doesn't explain itself. Its answers come in fragments: a journal beneath a cabin, initials scratched into rock, a single frame on a damaged tape. But those fragments tell us enough. Rick Monroe died trying to protect his family. Dana's fate remains uncertain, but her presence lingers in every clue Josh left behind. And Josh, at just 10 years old, navigated an unforgiving wilderness, leaving a trail not just for rescue, but for understanding. In the years since the camcorder was found, no one else has reported seeing him. No new shelters have turned up, no new clues. Some believe he didn't survive much longer after the ranger's sighting. Others believe he kept moving, shedding pieces of his past as he went, choosing to remain a ghost rather than return. But one fact remains clear. That dusty camcorder, lodged in the tunnel like a message in a bottle, was never just evidence. It was a voice calling back from the dark. And sometimes, that's enough. Not for closure, not for comfort, but for truth. The kind that doesn't fade, even after 11 years buried in dust and silence. The kind that still echoes, long after the camera stops rolling.